Mila steps off the plane, her heart pounding with a mixture of excitement and anxiety. She has left everything behind in the Philippines, her family, her friends, the familiar scent of home. Now she is in the United States, a land of opportunity, but also uncertainty clutching her back tightly. She reminds herself why she came here: to build a future, to send money back home, to prove that she can make it no matter what. Her first days are a whirlwind of adjustments. The cold air bites at her skin, the city is loud and fast paced, everything is different from what she knows, but she does not let it shake her. She quickly secures a job as a live-in caregiver for an elderly man named Mer Thompson. His family, a wealthy and seemingly busy group, rarely visits, leaving most of his care in her hands. The first time she meets him, she is struck by how frail he looks, his body thin, his face lined with years of memories. He stares at her, his grey eyes sharp but distant, as if searching for something in her face. Then, just as quickly, he turns away, as if whatever he was looking for is not there. Myla settles into her routine, caring for him, feeding him, helping him with daily tasks. Despite his dementia, there are moments when he seems eerily present, his fingers sometimes gripping her wrist too tightly, his lips moving as he whispers words she cannot quite hear. She dismisses it at first, chalking it up to his illness. But then something strange happens. One night, she is sitting by his bed reading softly to him when he suddenly murmurs a name she does not recognize. Liling, his voice is weak, but the urgency in it sends a chill down her spine. She leans closer, asking him who Liling is, but his eyes glaze over again, and he does not respond. Days pass, and the name Liling lingers in her mind. She begins to notice more peculiar things. Mer Thompson staring at her for long moments, his lips parting as if he wants to say something but stopping himself, the way he sometimes strokes the edge of his blanket with a faraway look in his eyes. Then one evening something happens that she cannot ignore. She is helping him with his meal, carefully spooning soft food into his mouth, when he suddenly reaches up, gripping her wrist, his hand trembling, his eyes filled with something she cannot quite place: sorrow, longing, regret. Before she can react, he speaks again, this time in broken Tagalog, a language she never expected to hear from him. Her breath catches, she tries to make sense of what he is saying, but his words are scattered fragments of sentences, half memories slipping from his grasp. The way he is looking at her sends a shiver down her spine. Myla does not know what to make of it. Her job is to care for him, not to unravel the mysteries of his past. Yet she cannot shake the feeling that something about this man, his words, his stares, his broken Tagalog, is connected to her in a way she does not yet understand. Myla cannot stop thinking about that moment, the way Mer Thompson gripped her wrist, the way his lips formed words in her language, the way his voice trembled as if he were lost in a memory too painful to hold yet too important to forget. She tells herself it is just the ramblings of an old man with dementia, but deep down she is not convinced. The next day, as she helps him get dressed, she watches him closely. His hands are weak, his movements slow. But when she buttons his shirt, he suddenly reaches up, brushing his fingers against her cheek, his eyes searching hers. Then, in a barely audible whisper, he says it again, Liling. Myla freezes, her heart hammering in her chest. The name again. Why is he saying it? She gently asks who Liling is, but he only shakes his head, as if frustrated by his own inability to explain. He grips the blanket, pulling it up to his chin, his body tense, his breathing unsteady. Myla knows she should not push him too hard, but something about his reaction makes her feel as if this is important, as if she needs to know the truth. That night she sits in her small room, scrolling through her phone, searching for any mention of a Liling connected to the Thompson family, but nothing comes up. She debates calling her mother back home. But what would she even say? Would her mother think she is imagining things? The next morning, as she prepares Mer Thompson's breakfast, she overhears his daughter and son-in-law talking in the hallway, their voices hushed. They rarely visit, but today they seem more tense than usual. She catches fragments of their conversation, something about the past, something about how he has been talking more lately. She strains to hear, but the moment she steps closer, they fall silent and glance at her, their expressions unreadable. Myla carries the breakfast tray into Mer Thompson's room, trying to shake the feeling that something is being kept from her. As she places the food on the table beside his bed, he suddenly reaches for her hand, his grip Surprisingly strong for someone so frail, his eyes lock onto hers, his lips parting as he struggles to speak. Mila, he says her name clearly for the first time. She shivers. How does he remember her name so perfectly when most days he forgets everything? She nods, encouraging him to continue. His breathing is uneven, his hands shaking. Liling, he repeats this time with more urgency. Mila swallows hard. She wants to ask him what he means, but before she can, he suddenly starts muttering in Tagalog again, his voice hoarse and full of emotion. She leans closer, trying to make sense of the words. He is saying it sounds like a memory, something about a promise, something about leaving, something about never seeing her again. Her skin prickles, her pulse racing. Why does he know these words? Why does he sound like he is mourning something lost long ago? She glances toward the door, debating whether to call his daughter in. But before she can move, Mel Thompson suddenly grips her hand even tighter, his gaze desperate, as if he is afraid she will disappear. His voice, barely above a whisper, "Do you remember me?" he asks. Mila feels her stomach drop, her mind whirling with confusion. Remember him? How? Why would she remember him? She has never met this man before in her life. Before she can respond, his energy seems to fade, his eyes grow distant, and his grip loosens. He sinks back into the bed, exhausted, his breathing shallow. The moment is gone. Mila sits frozen in place, her thoughts racing. Something is not right. She can feel it, she does not know how, but she is certain now. This is not just dementia, this is something else, something deeper, something that ties her to Miss Thompson in a way she cannot yet understand. Mila cannot sleep that night. Her mind keeps replaying Miss Thompson's words. "Do you remember me?" The way he looked at her, as if she was someone else, someone from his past. His desperate grip, his weak voice, whispering, liling over and over again. She tries to convince herself it is just the confusion of an old man, but deep down something feels different, something feels real. The next morning she moves through her routine, distracted as she helps Miss Thompson out of bed. She studies his face, watching for any sign of recognition, but today he seems more distant than before, his eyes unfocused, his hands weak. She wonders if he even remembers what he said to her yesterday, or if it was just a fleeting moment lost in the haze of his illness. She decides to test something while feeding him. She speaks in Tagalog, casually mentioning the word "liling" to see if he reacts. His spoon hovers in midair, his grip tightening around it. He looks at her, his expression unreadable for a few long seconds. Then, just as suddenly, he shakes his head and goes back to eating as if nothing happened. Mara exhales slowly, her heart racing. She is not imagining this. There is something about that name that reaches him, that pulls him out of his fog for just a moment. But what does it mean? Later that day, while cleaning his room, she notices an old wooden box on his bookshelf covered in dust. She hesitates, then carefully opens it. Inside, she finds faded letters, yellowed photographs, and an old locket. Her breath catches as she picks up one of the photographs. It is of a young man in a military uniform, standing next to a beautiful Filipino woman with kind eyes and a radiant smile. Her heart pounds as she turns the picture over. There is handwriting on the back. "My dearest Liling, always in my heart." Mira stares at the name, shock flooding through her veins. This cannot be a coincidence. She grips the photograph tightly, her hands shaking as a realization dawns on her. This woman, this Liling, is real, and somehow she is connected to Ma Thompson. Before she can process what to do next, a voice startles her. "What are you doing?" Miller whirls around to find Beth Thompson's daughter standing in the doorway, her arms crossed, her expression unreadable. Mila quickly puts the photograph back, but the woman steps forward, picking up the box with a heavy sigh. She looks at Mila for a long moment, then finally says, "You should sit down, we need to talk." Mila's pulse pounds as she slowly sinks into the chair, her hands resting on her lap. She watches as the woman pulls out the photographs, staring at it with a mixture of sadness and something else, something like regret. After a long silence, she speaks, her voice quiet but firm. "Years ago, my father was stationed in the Philippines." She begins. "He met a woman there, a woman he loved more than anything, but circumstances forced him to leave. She never knew what happened to him. He never knew what happened to her. All he had left were these letters, these memories, and the guilt of never going back." Mila feels her breath catch in her throat. This is real. This is not some random delusion from an old man's mind. This is history unfolding before her eyes. She swallows hard, her voice barely a whisper. Why does he keep saying her name? Why does he look at me like he knows me? The woman exhales deeply, pressing her lips together, as if debating whether to say the words that come next. When she finally speaks, her voice is laced with something Myla cannot quite place: pain, sorrow, maybe even hope. Because Myla, she says carefully, Liling was my grandmother, and if we are right, she was yours too. Myla feels the world tilt around her. Her breath catches her fingers, grip the edge of her chair as she stares at Ma Thompson's daughter. Did she hear that right? Her grandmother, her Lola Liling, was the same woman Ma Thompson loved all those years ago. How is that even possible? Her heart pounds in her chest, her thoughts racing. I don't understand, Mila finally says, her voice barely a whisper. There must be some mistake. The woman shakes her head, her eyes sad. But certain, I thought so too for a long time, she admits. But my father used to talk in his sleep. When I was a child, sometimes he would say her name, Liling. Sometimes he would apologize. I never understood it then. But when I got older, I found these letters. I realized he had left something unfinished in the Philippines, something that haunted him for decades. Mela looks down at the old wooden box, her hands trembling. She slowly reaches for one of the letters, unfolding the fragile paper. Inside is elegant handwriting filled with words of love and longing, words that were never sent. Tears sting her eyes as she reads them. Every sentence is a plea for forgiveness, a promise of return that was never fulfilled. She swallows hard, realizing the truth. Her Lola Liling spent her life waiting for a man who never came back, a man who had never forgotten her either. Her mind spins as she tries to process everything, but one question rises above the rest. Why does he look at me like that? Miller whispers. Why does he say my Lola's name like he knows me? The woman sighs, rubbing her temple. We don't know for sure, she says. But we think that maybe in his mind, he's seeing her again through you. Maybe to him you look like her. Or maybe the regret is so deep that his mind is trying to reach back through time. Either way, we can't deny that he remembers something even after all these years. Myla swallows hard. She looks over at Mer Thompson lying in bed, his breathing steady, his face peaceful. But now he is not just an old man in her care, he is someone connected to her past in a way she never imagined. Her great-grandfather, the missing piece of her Lola's story. Her hands curl into fists, her emotions swirl inside her: anger, sadness, disbelief. Why did he never come back? Why did her Lola have to grow old? Wondering if he had forgotten her. Did he ever try? Did he ever care? As if sensing her turmoil, Mer Thompson stirs, his eyes flutter open and land on Miller. He blinks slowly, his gaze searching, then his lips part, and he whispers the name again, Liling. Miller swallows the lump in her throat, forcing herself to stay calm. She takes a shaky breath and does something she has never done before. She reaches for his hand, gently holding it between her own. Mer Thompson's fingers twitch weakly, his eyes glisten with something Myra cannot quite place: regret, sorrow, relief. Myra, she says softly, trying to hold back the emotion threatening to choke her. My name is Myra, and not Liling, but she was my grandmother. She watches his face closely for any sign of understanding. For a long moment, he simply stares at her, then something in his expression shifts. His lips quiver, his breath catches. He squeezes her hand with the little strength he has left, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. I never stopped loving her, he whispers, and for the first time Myla does not see a frail old man. She sees a young soldier full of love and regret, a man who never got to say goodbye. Myla feels her chest tighten as she watches the old man's eyes fill with tears, his fingers trembling against hers. His words echo in her mind over and over again. I never stopped loving her. She swallows hard, struggling to find her voice. Her heart is pounding, her emotions tangled between anger, sadness, and something she cannot quite name. Why? Miller finally asks, her voice barely above a whisper. Why didn't you come back? Her question hangs heavy in the air. Mer Thompson's breath stutters, his lips parting as if he is searching for the right words. For a long moment, he says nothing, then his gaze drifts toward the window, his eyes lost in a faraway memory. I tried, he says, his voice weak but firm. I wrote to her. I begged her to wait, but the war changed everything. I was sent home. Before I could return, I had no choice. Myla grips his hand tighter, her mind racing with all the stories her grandmother used to tell about a man she once loved, a man she waited for. But the letters never came. She never knew if he forgot about her or if he had moved on. But she never got your letters, Myla says, shaking her head, her voice trembling. She thought you abandoned her. She thought you never wanted to come back. Miss Thompson's face crumples, his fingers clenching around hers. His breathing becomes uneven. He shakes his head. No, no, he murmurs, his voice breaking. I would never abandon her. I searched for her for years, but I never found her. I had to move on. I had to live. Mela feels something deep inside her crack open. All those years her Lola had waited, all those years Miss Thompson had searched, and yet fate had kept them apart. She exhales a shaky breath, pressing a hand against her forehead, her thoughts spinning with too many emotions at once. Then suddenly his hand grips hers tighter, his eyes locking onto hers with a desperate intensity. Mila, he whispers again, but this time his voice sounds different, more urgent. You have to forgive me, please forgive me. She blinks, taken aback, her throat tightening. She is not the one who needs to forgive him. Her Lola is gone now, and she will never hear the words he should have said decades ago. But looking at him now, seeing the pain in his face, the regret in his eyes, Mela realizes something. He has carried this weight for a lifetime, just like her Lola did. Neither of them ever stopped loving each other, neither of them ever truly let go. But it is too late now, the past cannot be rewritten. Miller inhales deeply, her fingers tightening around his hand. Lola waited for you, she says softly. She never stopped loving you, and she never hated you for leaving. She just wanted to know why, she just wanted to understand. Mer Thompson's face twists with emotion. A single tear escapes, sliding down his wrinkled cheek. His lips tremble, his voice barely above a whisper. I loved her so much, I still do. Miller watches as his chest rises and falls unsteadily. His eyes begin to flutter closed, his strength fading. Panic grips her chest. She looks up at his daughter, who is standing by the door, her hands clasped tightly together, her face pale. Is he okay? Miller asks, her voice shaking. His daughter quickly steps forward, her own eyes wet with unshed tears. He's tired, she says softly. He needs to rest. Miller nods. But as she starts to pull away, Miss Thompson's grip tightens again, his fingers barely holding onto hers. Don't go, he murmurs, please don't go. Myra swallows hard tears, stinging her own eyes. For the first time in weeks, she does not see him as just her patient. She sees him as the man her Lola once loved, the man who spent a lifetime searching for what was lost. And now she realizes that maybe, just maybe, she was meant to find him instead. Mila stays by Miss Thompson's side long after he drifts into sleep, her fingers still lightly curled around his breathing is steady but shallow, his body weak, his face lined with decades of unspoken sorrow. She watches him carefully, wondering how much time he has left, wondering if fate has given them these last moments so he can finally find peace. She leans back in her chair, staring at the ceiling, her mind still spinning with everything she has learned. She thinks of her Lola, how she used to sit by the window in the afternoons, watching the street, as if waiting for someone who never came back. She remembers the quiet sadness in her eyes, the way she would smile, but never talk about the past. Mila had always thought it was just a love story that had ended too soon, but now she knows it was never really over. As the hours pass, Myla finds herself unable to leave. Every time she starts to stand, but Thompson's grip tightens, as if he can sense her presence even in sleep. His daughter brings her a blanket, urging her to rest, but Myla shakes her head. She cannot leave, not yet, not when there is still so much unsaid. Later that night, as the house grows quiet and the air turns colder, Miss Thompson stirs, his eyes fluttering open. For a moment, he looks lost, confused. Then his gaze lands on Mila, and something in his expression softens. He takes a deep breath and exhales slowly. Mila, he murmurs. She leans forward. Yes, I'm here, she says gently. His lips part as if he wants to say something important, but the words do not come. Instead, he lifts a trembling hand, his fingers reaching toward her face. Mila hesitates, then takes his hand, guiding it gently to rest against her palm. His skin is cool, his grip weak, but his touch is full of something unspoken, something deeper than words. Thank you, he whispers. Mila swallows hard, unsure of what to say. Thank you for what she asks, for finding me. He says, for not letting me leave this world alone. His words send a sharp ache through her chest. She looks down at their joined hands, remembering how her Lola used to hold hers when she was a child. She wonders if this is what fate intended for her, not just to take care of him, but to bring him the closure he never had. Mela shifts in her seat, staring at him carefully. Can I ask you something? She says softly. Thompson nods, his eyelids heavy. Have you ever been back to the Philippines? She asks. His expression darkens, his lips pressing together. No, he says, I wanted to, but I was afraid. Afraid of what? Miller whispers. Afraid that she had moved on, afraid that she hated me, afraid of what I would find if I went back. His voice trails off, his eyes wet with memories that have haunted him for a lifetime. Mila exhales, slowly gripping his hand tighter. She knows her Lola never moved on. She knows her Lola never hated him. But she also knows he will never hear those words from her lips. He will never be able to make things right the way he wanted to. She takes a deep breath and does the only thing she can. It's okay, she says softly. It's okay now. But Thompson's face crumples. He closes his eyes and nods, his breathing shaky. Miller watches him carefully, feeling something inside her shift for the first time in her life. She feels like she is exactly where she is supposed to be, not just as his caregiver, but as a bridge between the past and the present, as the person who can finally bring him the peace he has been searching for all these years. The night feels heavy as Mila stays by Miss Thompson's side, his breathing slow, his face pale against the dim light of the room. She knows he is tired, she knows his body is failing him, but there is something in the way he holds her hand, something that tells her he is still holding on, as if waiting for something that has yet to come. Miller watches him carefully, thinking of her Lola, thinking of the life that could have been if things had been different. She wonders if love ever truly fades, or if it lingers waiting for the right moment to be remembered. She takes a deep breath and then softly speaks. Lola used to sit by the window every day, she says, her voice barely above a whisper. She waited for you for years. She thought maybe one day you would come back. Miss Thompson's eyes flutter open, his gaze distant, as if he is seeing something that is not there. She never forgot you, Myra continues. She never stopped loving you. His lips part, his breath shaky. I should have gone back, I should have tried harder. His voice is full of regret, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. Mira grips his hand tighter. There is no point in telling him what he should have done. The past cannot be changed. But maybe, just maybe, he can find peace in the present. She reaches into the wooden box beside the bed, carefully pulling out the old locket she found earlier. She opens it, revealing the tiny photograph inside, a younger version of her Lola, smiling the same soft, warm smile that Mida remembers. She gently places it in Miss Thompson's palm, watching as his fingers tremble around it. I kept this, he whispers, his thumb brushing over the faded image. All these years I kept this with me. Mira watches his expression shift, the pain, the longing, the love, all of it etched onto his face, as if decades of emotions are finally unraveling. He lets out a slow breath, his body relaxing slightly as he holds the locket to his chest. Mila takes a deep breath, her voice soft. Lola is gone now, she says. But I think if she were here, she would tell you that she forgives you. She would want you to be at peace. Miss Thompson's eyes flutter closed, his lips trembling. I loved her so much, he whispers. I never stopped loving her. Mila nods. Even though he cannot see her, she knows he is holding on to these final moments. Then his grip on her hand weakens, his breathing grows fainter. Mila feels panic rise in her chest, but she forces herself to stay calm. She glances toward the doorway, where his daughter stands, watching, tears streaming down her face. She takes a shaky step forward, kneeling beside the bed, her hands covering his gently. Dad, she whispers, her voice breaking. I love you. Miss Thompson does not respond. His breath is slow, his body still. Mila leans closer, her own eyes wet with tears. It's okay, she says softly. You can rest now. You are not alone. The room falls into silence. Myra watches as Miss Thompson's chest rises one last time, then exhales slowly, his grip finally releasing. His daughter lets out a quiet sob, pressing her forehead against his hand. Myla feels her own tears slip down her cheeks. She knows he is gone, but somehow the weight that had been pressing on her chest feels lighter, as if a story that had been left unfinished for decades has finally found its ending. She looks down at the locket still clutched in his fingers, and for the first time she understands that love never truly disappears, it simply waits to be remembered. The air in the room feels different, now quieter, heavier. Miller watches Mer Thompson's still form, his hand no longer gripping hers, his face peaceful, as if he has finally let go. She swallows hard, wiping at the tears on her cheeks. His daughter is holding his hand tightly, her own shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Miller takes a slow breath, looking down at the locket, still clutched in his fingers. Something about it feels sacred, like a connection between two souls that had been waiting decades to reunite. She gently pries it from his hand, her fingers shaking as she holds it in her palm. The metal is worn, the photograph inside faded, but the love it carries is still strong, still real. His daughter finally lifts her head, her eyes red and filled with emotion. "Thank you," she whispers. Miller blinks at her, unsure of what to say. For what she finally asks, her voice barely above a whisper, for staying with him, for giving him peace, in the end for letting him know he was never forgotten. Her words hit Miller deep in her chest. She nods, unable to speak, her throat too tight with emotion. Later, as the house fills with quiet voices and the presence of those who have come to say their final goodbyes, Mala steps outside into the cool night air. She looks up at the sky, thinking of her Lola, thinking of Mer Thompson and the love they shared. She wonders if somehow, somewhere, their souls have finally found each other again. She grips the locket tightly in her hand before pulling out her phone, her fingers hesitating over the screen. Before she dials her mother's number, it is late, but she knows her mother will pick up on the second ring. "Miller, Anak, is everything okay?" Her mother's voice is groggy but laced with concern. Miller takes a deep breath, then slowly exhales. "Mama," she says softly, "I found Lola's love story." There is silence on the other end, then a quiet intake of breath. "What do you mean?" her mother finally asks. Mila swallows hard, struggling to find the right words. But then she realizes there is no way to explain it all at once. She will have to tell it piece by piece, just like Lola used to tell her stories. "Do you remember the American soldier Lola used to talk about, the one she waited for all those years?" Her mother hums softly. "Yes, of course." Mala closes her eyes, gripping the locket tighter. "Mama, I was taking care of him." Her mother gasps, the sound sharp and full of shock. "What?" Miller nods, even though her mother cannot see her. "It was him, Mama. It was him all this time." Her mother does not respond right away, but Miller can hear her breathing quick and uneven, as if she is trying to hold back tears. "Oh, Anak," she whispers finally, "that is fate." Mila feels her own tears slip down her cheeks. She nods again, smiling softly. "Yeah, Mama, I think so too." She looks down at the locket one last time before pressing it against her heart. She knows this story has come full circle. She knows Mer Thompson is at peace now, and maybe, just maybe, her Lola is too. The days after Mer Thompson's passing feel strange to Miller. The house is quieter, the routines she had grown used to are no longer needed. The man who once gripped her hand and whispered her grandmother's name is gone, and yet she still feels his presence lingering in the space he left behind. His daughter asks Milo to stay for a while longer to help with the arrangements, and though she could have left the moment he passed, something inside her tells her to stay. She watches as family members come and go, offering condolences, speaking in hushed voices. But it is not until the funeral that Miller truly understands the weight of what has happened. The day is overcast with a soft breeze rustling the leaves. Miller stands at the edge of the gathering, watching as the ceremony unfolds. She listens as people share stories about Mer Thompson, about the life he lived, the kindness he showed, the sacrifices he made. But no one speaks of Liling, no one but her. When it is her turn to speak, Mila steps forward, her heart pounding. She looks at the faces of those who knew him, his daughter, his friends, his colleagues. Then she takes a deep breath and begins. "I knew Mer Thompson as my patient," she says softly, "but I also knew him as something else, something more." She pauses, gripping the locket in her hand, the same locket he held onto in his final moments. "He was the man my grandmother loved, the man she waited for, the man who never stopped loving her, even when life kept them apart." A murmur ripples through the crowd. People exchange glances, but no one interrupts. Myra continues, her voice steadier now. "He spent his life carrying regret, But in the end, I think he found peace knowing that she never forgot him, knowing that the love they shared was real. And even though they never got to say goodbye, I believe that somewhere, somehow, they have found each other again. Her voice catches at the last words, and she swallows hard, looking down at the locket for a long moment. Then she steps forward and kneels by the casket, pressing the locket against the smooth wood. She whispers a silent prayer before placing it down, leaving it with him so he can carry it with him wherever he is going. As she rises, she feels a sense of closure, a feeling she cannot quite describe, as if something that had been left unfinished for decades has finally found its ending. She steps back and feels a gentle hand on her shoulder. She turns to see Miss Thompson's daughter, her eyes filled with tears. "Thank you," she whispers, her voice breaking. "Thank you for giving him peace." Mila nods, unable to speak. Instead, she grips the woman's hand for a brief moment, then steps away, letting her have her final goodbye. Later, as the guests leave and the grave is covered, Mila stands alone for a while, staring at the freshly turned earth. The wind is cool against her skin, and she closes her eyes, taking a deep breath. She thinks of her Lola, she thinks of Mer Thompson, she thinks of the love that never faded. When she finally turns to leave, she does not feel the heaviness she expected. Instead, she feels light, as if she is walking away with something new, something unseen, but deeply felt. Love does not disappear, it does not fade with time, it simply waits for the right moment, waits for the right people to find it again. As she steps into the car, she pulls out her phone, dialing her mother's number again. When her mother answers, Mela smiles softly. "Mama," she says, "I think Lola has finally stopped waiting."